participation as possible, but that will severely test my ability to control the meeting in this format. We'll be recording the event and it will be posted on the relevant websites sometime later on. So if I can ask you all to turn off your videos and mute yourself to start with, that should just leave the four of us on the panel, plus our moderator, who is Luis, who's president of GATCO. I've got a few questions already just to get us started, but when you want to ask a question, if you could click on Luis, send him a private message on the chat. Luis will collate them all, feed them through to me, and if you want to make a point in the subsequent debate, can I just ask you to use the function at the bottom to raise your hand or just put your video on? Then we can see that you're waiting and I'll just find a convenient moment to bring you in. It could be like herding cats, but I'll do my best. We've got a slide showing on the screen there at the moment with some relevant headings. It's not really a checklist, just an aid memoir for you guys just to have a think about and maybe prompt some questions. I'm sure that we'll have some answers for you here on the panel, but we've also got a massive amount of knowledge in the room, so please feel very free to share it with us. So for the introductions, I'll start with myself then. I was trained at the College of Air Training at Hamble, graduating in 1976. The usual period of unemployment followed, but I was lucky enough to get a job with British Caledonian Airways. I flew the BAC 111 there, 707 and DC-10. The merger with BA happened in 1988, and then I had a transfer to the wonderful Boeing 747-400, RIP now, unfortunately. Then I spent the rest of my career on the 777 with a 2-year spell on the 787. I was a TRI, TRE from 1994 all the way till the last couple of years when they let me wind down flying to the Caribbean, enjoying the sunsets and a few beers on the beach. And I retired just earlier this year, fortunately a couple of days before the lockdown started. The rest of us on the panel made up of pilots and air traffic controllers. Linton's the other pilot, so maybe I could ask Linton just to introduce himself.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name's Linton Fote. Originally from Australia, I started my career with Qantas up in Sydney on the engineering side of things with the 747-767. Came across to Europe and was very fortunate to be picked up on an airline sponsorship with what was called Air Tours in those days. Through the different mergers and changes over the years, my travel, and then finally Thomas Cook, which unfortunately saw its demise last year. So recently I've been out in Japan flying with Jetstar Japan, but with COVID, sees myself back on the ground at the moment, just waiting to see what's coming next. So been around a little bit and seen a few different things, and hopefully can contribute to this discussion today.
Thanks very much, Linton, and our two fine ATCOs there. We've got Tom. Do you want to kick off?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Tom Harrison. I've been an air traffic controller now for nearly 19 years. I actually started out applying for the cadetship with British Airways, and I managed to get through to have a final board penciled in for September 2001. So unfortunately that didn't happen. I became an ATCO. I'm an en route or area controller, and I work just outside of Southampton in the disused quarry that is the London area terminal and terminal control centre at Swanwick. I have validations on the Dover, Lydd, Seaford Herne, London Middle and the London Upper sectors. When I did my initial training, I actually spent some time, you were fortunate enough at the time to get a tower rating, which you don't get anymore. So I actually spent some time at Luton and Birmingham Towers as familiarisation. I'm an instructor and a competency assessor, and I've worked on a few different projects with my employer, including the introduction of CPDLC, our medium-term conflict detection system, which is IFACS, and a new flight planning system, as well as some other bits and pieces. I've been a member of GATCO since I started my training, and I've been on the executive board for GATCO for the last 5 years and hold the post of Manager of Technical and Operations.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And last but certainly not least, Jules.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Jules Ogilvie. I started my career as an air traffic controller back in 1995 at Heathrow Tower, the old tower, the original. I still have a brick from that period that's in the garage downstairs. Worked there for 5 years and then moved on to Switzerland, where I became an approach radar controller for Geneva and also a low-level area radar controller at the same time, center supervisor. Then challenges changed and I fancied coming back to the UK, came back to the UK and worked as an approach radar controller at Heathrow and Gatwick airports. And then things changed again. I went back to Switzerland and I'm currently a tower and approach radar controller in Geneva, tower supervisor, instructor, competency assessor, and all that stuff as well. I'm also involved in the project, the implementation of a arrivals manager into both Zurich and Geneva airports. And I was involved at the time in the validation of the time-based separation project into Heathrow Airport. I've been a member of GATCO since 2009. I was briefly president and then handed over to Luis, and now part of the Swiss Controllers Association, Helvetica.
Thanks, Jules. That's brilliant. And as I said, I can see from the list of participants, there's loads of people with loads of experience in the room. So please, this is for you guys to get involved with and just ask each other the questions you've always wanted to ask. I've just got one to kick off because it's the elephant in the room really at the moment with COVID. Andy asked on our forum, Andy's a captain now, I think, on the A320 at Heathrow. And just to read out his question, he's uncomfortably aware of his deterioration in his skills over the last few months and feels like he's wading through treacle. So he asked, do the controllers feel the same way? How do they keep themselves up to speed when they're not at work? How do they feel when they are at work? And to slow things down as pilots are able to do at times. And at the end, he apologizes to all controllers that he has to deal with him at the moment. So maybe Tom or Jules could kick us off with how they feel on that one.
Okay, so from an operational side of things, it's been obviously a very challenging and difficult period in a number of different ways. We have gone through peaks and troughs still. With the ending of the lockdown, we had a surge in traffic, and we still had the peaks in the early morning and a second peak at lunchtime, like we would do for most summers. It was tricky because skills had become a little bit rusty, so we were very cautious and very careful not to put ourselves in situations where we had too much traffic. But inevitably, there was some element of skill fade. It's been very carefully managed, and the management and the competency team have been well aware that people have been going off on furlough because my company took advantage of the scheme. So they've been coming back after perhaps a number of weeks outside the operation. And when that happens, we have a controller sit with them just to make sure that they're up to speed. There has been training and simulations going on to keep controllers at a competency level, but it has been difficult, and there have been occasions where people have been caught out because when it is quiet, we're trying to take full advantage and send aircraft on direct routings, get continuous climbs where we can, continuous descents. But when you start to do that, that actually increases your workload because you've got to speak to the next controller because it's coming through a point in their airspace which isn't a normal point. So you've got to coordinate that direct routing, you've got to check for danger area activity, and your workload does actually go up. So if you're starting to send a lot of aircraft on direct routings, and then suddenly 4 or 5 get airborne at once from Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton, Stansted, or wherever, suddenly you've got a lot more work to do on the sector that you weren't really expecting. So that's been a difficulty as well. It's a concerning time as well for the controllers, because my company certainly hasn't got endless pots of money, and with these levels of traffic, it will be unsustainable. It will come to a point where it's unsustainable, and cutbacks will have to be made. There's obviously been a lot of pain in the industry as it is, and we've been somewhat shielded from that. But I'm sure there will be changes in the coming months and years ahead.
Great, thanks, Tom. Jules?
From my employer's perspective and where we are here, it's very, very similar. In fact, we don't have a furlough on a monthly basis, which is the way I think Nat's employed it, but we certainly have it on a more of a daily basis. So our periods without being at work are much less, which is good. But however, we're very, very obviously low in traffic. And I feel exactly as Andy's question, and Andy said in his question, that I feel as though I'm also going through a little bit of wading through mud as well. One of the issues that we came up with, we have continuation training. We have 4 days of continuation training here a year, one of which we have dedicated to training at last year's traffic levels, basically, to keep our standards up. And we try to do that as often as possible. Training for ab initios is also obviously an issue as well. We have a certain number of them through the actual college system, and also doing on-the-job training and instruction. We went through a period, obviously, the first lockdown, where we couldn't train any of the students. In fact, they weren't allowed to be set foot in the premises. Then they came back. Obviously, the traffic wasn't up to speed, so we then combined a bit of simulation training and also live training, and also pushed a few people through their final checks that way as well, which is a novel idea for the controllers community. On a personal level, yes, it's certainly been a very much of a shock. The first time I've ever been to a busy airport and actually heard birds sing, and obviously that has a bit of a personal toll as well. And I think I've seen that through the comrades at work. On a level through Swiss controllers, we've received cash from the government, the Federal Council, and they have obviously implied conditions with that kind of cash, one of which is increasing the retirement age for controllers throughout the country. So that's one of the things that we're having to go through and discuss and negotiate at the same time. That's probably it from me.
Oh, thanks, Jules. Linton, do you recognise how Andy feels?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. Each operator obviously is going to have their own plan about how they're going to bring crew back online and what sort of level of training is required. But the normal sort of 6 monthly cyclic, I guess that's the big question: is that sufficient? And what other ways do we have of certainly, bringing ourselves back up to speed? So I guess the ability to do some armchair flying and things like that is probably one of the most effective ways at home that you can sort of put yourself in the picture and try and get those routines sort of practice. But it's very, very difficult, isn't it, to simulate the live environment. My experience in Japan was, Tokyo Narita, one of the busiest airports around. What could be a 40 or 50 minute taxi turned out to be a 15-minute taxi, because traffic was just so light. So in some ways, I think actually the pressure point may be when everything ramps up and we get back to that level of intensity that we've not seen for a long time, and the ability to, as Andrew said in his question, will we have a mechanism to slow things down if we're uncertain or unsure? So I guess as pilots, we're trained in that sort of risk sort of management, and we need to be very aware that if we feel uncomfortable, that we need to speak up, not only to one another, but to ourselves, and try and slow things down.
Yeah, brilliant. I just wondered, I was just thinking there as Jules and Tom were talking, can you tell when you feel the pilots are struggling up there a little bit? Is that apparent in their either their actions or their speech?
From my side, from what I've seen so far, it's been great. There hasn't been too much of a change, to tell you the truth. However, I can certain familiarity with procedures and things obviously is different. As Tom brought up beforehand, the actual us trying to help out sometimes may actually hinder the flight deck crew as such overall, if we're offering shortcuts all the time and direct routings, and especially in the Geneva scenario, a dirty dive into the airfield. And if you're not happy with it, then please do let us know.
I would only add, the only thing that I have noticed is perhaps when it is particularly quiet, sometimes you might have to make 1 or 2 more calls to get an aircraft's attention, get a crew's attention.
Yeah, which is always an indication that they're. We always talk about sort of workload, but people coming to work with their bucket half full already, whether it be, you know, personal issues or recency issues and stuff like that. So that just reduces their capacity by that much, doesn't it? Just a question, Godwin, when you talk about cuts to staffing, how quickly would NATS be able to react should a vaccination program open up destinations and subsequently the skies to increase traffic?
Well, that's one of the difficulties, really. Fortunately, so far, there haven't been any talks about cuts to the numbers of controllers. I know other organisations around the country are facing those difficult challenges and have made cuts or are going to make cuts. The difficulty is the length of time it takes to train a valid controller. We don't have, although we all learn the basics, we have very specific validations on pieces of airspace or particular towers or approach units. And so we can't quickly switch a number of staff from one sector to another. That's, in a way, that helps to protect us in our roles, but also it presents difficulties when the traffic does go a particular way. In the summer, we had that a little bit because some of the sectors where there weren't quarantine restrictions there was high demand, and then there were other sectors with a lot of spare capacity. And it's one of the inflexibilities that I believe Luis talked about last week in the system, is that the sectors are solid blocks of airspace that people have validations on, and they're not dynamic enough to match the flows of air traffic and the demands on particular routes. So that's something that could be looked at in the coming years and months, especially while it is quiet, to improve some of that flexibility in the system, should we say.
Okay, brilliant. I'll just throw it open to the audience. Is there anybody in the audience wants to sort of tell us how they feel at the moment, or yeah, how they feel going to work, etc.? All quiet. I'll take that as a no then. Hang on, I've just got a chat down here. No, that was on a separate thing. Okay, it's going to be with us for quite a while, and we could probably make the whole chat about the present situation, but I'll move on to another question that was asked on the forum, and it came from 320 skipper at Heathrow. Quite a general one. Why are we limited to 6,000 feet departing Heathrow? If departures climb straight to flight level 110, for example, that saves fuel, time, less noise, less emissions, and arriving traffic will be less constricted. He feels he could be at Biggin by flight level 110 or above, presumably when he's departing eastbound. So why are we driving around like we did in 1955? Which is very hurtful because that was my birth year, but pass it on to Tom and Jules. Okay,
Jules is probably the expert to answer this, really, with his Heathrow knowledge, but I'll have a go. It is historical. It's an issue with the SIDS and the STARS and the transition altitude. We've got a patchwork of transition altitudes around the country, over 3,000 feet or 6,000 feet. With Heathrow departures, the SIDS climb out to 6,000 feet, and the top level of the stack is either flight level 70 or 80. So it provides the separation at Biggin, at Lambourne, at Bovingdon, at Ockham. There was a big project a few years ago that I was involved with to change the transition altitude. It got very close to coming in. Unfortunately, it didn't happen for a number of reasons, including the fact that the rest of Europe were slow in, well, slow is perhaps the wrong word, but at different stages of introducing a uniform transition altitude of their own. So then you get problems at the boundaries. There is still ongoing work with the lower airspace modernization program to enable some of the departure routes and the arrival routes, certainly the departure routes, to be extended and to climb to higher altitudes. But the problem there is that it's such a maze and a jigsaw of inbound and outbound routes into the London TMA especially, and at Manchester and at Glasgow, that when you try and unpick it and rebuild it from the ground up, you've got to get everybody's agreement and you've got to change everything. You've almost got to wipe the slate clean and start again. And the LAMP project was intending to do that. It was almost a complete redesign. If one airfield doesn't like a particular route because they feel that they're being unfairly disadvantaged, the arrival routes or the departure routes are going to be longer, then they may not be happy. Obviously, when we're talking about departure routes, you've got to take into consideration noise and where these routes are going to overfly. So there was a lot of backlash from members of the public. And it's a very difficult project. As I say, ideally, you would switch the system off and turn it back on with a brand new set of routes that do allow continuous climb to a much higher level. But without a whole change and including transition altitude changes, unfortunately, that's not going to happen in the short term. One other thing with my GATCO hat on and going back to the previous question, this quiet period would be a perfect opportunity to introduce new systems, bed in new routes and things like that. Unfortunately, they take a long time to create. And unfortunately, at this time, there is obviously a reluctance to make big changes or to spend a lot of money on changes when, in an ideal world, this level of traffic would give that opportunity.
I don't have much. Yeah, thanks, Mike. I don't have much to add to Tom's eloquent reply there, other than the fact that it really is historic, and Heathrow was the centre of especially the London TMA at the time, and every other airport around there. So Luton, Stansted, and Gatwick were therefore designed with respect to Heathrow procedures. So yes, I understand that being stuck. As he mentioned very briefly at the end there, about the quiet period now being an ideal situation to bring in new technology. We managed to introduce.
Sorry, Julian, might have to interrupt you there. We seem to be having problems. The usual Swiss efficiency seems to be letting you down at that end.
Apologies. The lower traffic this year to introduce flight progress strip.
Okay, well, can we just switch to Linton? Any views or any thoughts on what's been discussed?
Only that the legislation has changed in the UK, and that instead of the DFT driving airspace change, are now going to be put the CAA will have kind of control of that. So the airspace modernization plan, if you've not heard about it, you can kind of Google that and find that on the CAA's website. They're going to be looking at sort of, making a whole scale change. So as Tom sort of mentioned earlier on, to do this piecemeal is very, very difficult. So I think to kind of have a look at airspace change as a whole scale thing, especially as we're going to turn off conventional nav aids. They're not going to be available to us, and things like RMP is going to be such a big way that we conduct our business, not only from air traffickers side, but also from us, an operational side, which will bring some great benefits, but it also has some issues as well, which I'm sure we'll touch on later on in this webcast.
Okay, thanks, Linton. As part of my job on the Air Traffic Services Group, I go to some of these meetings on airspace modernisation with ICAMS, NatMac, and these other organisations. And I think the good news in the last couple of years is there's an acceptance by the government that this all forms part of our national infrastructure, and that something does have to change. And at last, yeah, Tom talked about LAMP and whatnot, and sort of bits of it were brought in, but a lot of it was sort of. But I think there's a new push there at the moment to get this going. The airspace modernisation structure is there. We've got ACOG has been formed, which are going to help to bring the whole thing together. That's being led by a chap called Mark Swan. Mark seems a really excellent choice for it. And we've been pushing as well for trying to change the approach to transition altitude. Mark Swan actually was head of the organisation CAP 1417. I think if you've got some spare time, I think it is. And that project, it wasn't binned, it was sort of put under, I think they called it care and consideration. And but I think the thing that's going to trigger a change in it is the use of drones and unmanned systems, because there's a project in Europe talking about geometric altitude. I think these drones are going to be flying anything up to, could be up to 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. They're going to be using geometric altitude while we're all using something else. So hopefully there will be, and as you say, there's a quiet period coming up for all of us, unfortunately, but it may be the ideal time to try and change things. So hopefully Julian's back with us. I hope, I don't know if you can hear us all right. How?
Fine, I believe that's okay.
You may have to turn your video off if you. Excellent, yeah. Excellent. I've got another a couple of questions. This time a CPDLC, if I can get you to put your CPDLC hats on. Another question of another skipper at on the 320 at Heathrow. He talks about a large variance in usage. UK doesn't seem to use it very much, but Germany does. Is there a technical reason for this, or do they just push it more? And he makes the comment, although it makes life easier, I prefer voice, but how is the controller workload affected?
Very good question. So it is a very useful tool, but it also has some limitations. Doing the sectors that I do, I work the outbound traffic going past Dover, and then the inbound traffic coming in through the Worthing sector, for example, where it's a lot of instructions in a short space of time, and they are very time critical. I need to ensure that an aircraft takes up a heading quickly, gets a descent for another aircraft as quickly as possible so they can resume a routing back on the arrival route. And CPDLC doesn't lend itself very well to doing that. Certainly the fan system, which I believe is predominantly in the Boeing aircraft, we have issues with the length of time it takes for the message to be received, sent back, and we have a problem with what we call timeouts. I'll come back to that in a minute. With the higher sectors that I do, the London upper sector, for example, the instructions that I'm issuing aren't perhaps so time critical. So therefore, I tend to use the CPDLC messages a lot more to send aircraft direct, to transfer things from the frequency, and so forth. One of the advantages on the short sectors where there's a lot of transmissions to be made is that things which aren't time critical, perhaps transferring an aircraft to the next frequency for an overflight, I will do that on occasion because that will help to reduce my workload. Certainly on the lid sector, the RT occupancy can be as high as 100% for a few minutes at a time. As I'm sure you all who fly on those routings are aware, you can often check in on the frequency and barely find a time to speak. It's the timeout issue with the fans aircraft. What I don't want is to have to wait 2 minutes, not receive a response, and then have to transmit to the aircraft to ask you to disconnect from the system, just in case that message is then received later on, and it acted upon when inappropriately. With the ATN system, it's got an automatic timeout function, so we don't have to worry about that. If the message isn't acted upon or received, it just gets deleted from the system. So that's a big advantage. If all aircraft had the ATN system, I think we would use it a bit more on some of the shorter, punchier sectors. But you may notice it's used a lot in Maastricht because it's high-level airspace, and perhaps you've got a little bit more time when you're in the cruise. The instructions aren't so time critical. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Jules, but I assume working at the lower level airspace, you don't have much involvement with CPDLC.
No, that's correct. And in fact, in Swiss airspace, it's only frequency changes that are allowed to be passed over through CPDLC, and obviously departure clearances on the ground. In Geneva, I think it's coming into place into Zurich, where it has just done so very recently. But once again, as Tom said, it's all about time critical instructions. Heading, descent, speed, and all that kind of stuff is what we need the flight deck to reply to as soon as possible. So therefore, CPDLC isn't the way to go ahead in that particular case.
Linton, what's your thoughts about CPDLC usage?
Yeah, the implementation sort of stalled a little bit, didn't it, with across Europe, but more and more regions are picking up on it. And then having operated out in the Far East, I think you could really see the advantages of it because of the language barrier. Actually, Tokyo Control very, very strict in the way that they want a readback to happen. So, if we could improve the performance of the system, I think it'd be a real benefit for everybody. And I think there's some frustration out there from the operators, from the pilot side of things, that it's a great system when it works, a little bit frustrating when it doesn't. And those of us that have operated transatlantic for a long time, it's such an improvement over having to use HF frequency and trying to check in that you can, request a deviation of what's required in that upper level airspace. But I'm not sure whether pilots are aware, but I think, Tom, is it flight level 195? Below that, it shouldn't be, it won't be used. So I'm not sure whether all pilots are aware of that. At the lower levels, you won't get that, the messages coming through. But as we progress towards 4D navigation, so with a sort of a takeoff time and a landing time as part of an optimized sort of flight plan, we should see that take up become even more prevalent. But I think the frustration for pilots is the inconsistencies of where it is in use and knowing where it is in use, where you should be able to log on and get a good connection. So in my previous operator, we used to produce a map that was accessible on the electronic flight bag, so guys knew where it was possible to log on and have a good service and where it wasn't sort of worth going for. So that's probably the other thing that the industry could really help with is kind of promulgating, where it's in use and where it should be used and where it's not fully in use.
If I may add a couple more of the limitations I've thought about while Linton was talking about that. As you quite rightly say, we can send messages below flight level 195, but we are supposed to only use it above flight level 195. The fan system will allow you to send a message to route to a VOR. Unfortunately, that system won't differentiate, I believe, between whether that is a VOR or a airfield beacon. And there have been instances, not in UK airspace, but anecdotally in Belgium airspace, where an aircraft turned a long way from its track because it was fed the wrong information. One of the issues which I've encountered as well, if you are to send a message with a number of fixes, I believe it appears in the FMS, Linton, perhaps you could confirm, as route direct to Rodol via Brookmans Park, Detling, for example. And there have been occasions where the crew will take that as route direct to Rodol because that's what's appeared on the front page of the FMS, when in fact the message isn't route direct to Rodol. So there are limitations, but it's a really useful tool, and I hope that newer iterations of the system will allow us to use it more. I like being able to pick and choose when I use it at the moment, but I can see it being a stepping stone to becoming an air traffic manager as opposed to a controller, where we are simply monitoring flight planned routes and sending amendments to routes all electronically, and there will be no voice communication or very, very little voice communication.
If I may add just briefly, sorry, if I may add briefly, Tom, is Eurocontrol, so Maastricht Upper Airspace Centre do actually have a project at the moment about using CPDLC instructions to control aircraft at night and during low traffic scenarios, but completely autonomously as well. So it's actually an algorithm controlling the aircraft via CPDLC, and that's only it's a project and experiment at the moment. But one day, perhaps, as Tom was saying, that'll become more widespread.
I think that's always the case with this new technology. Always ever a stepping stone. People sort of put up with the limitations of it, thinking, well, yes, it's not perfect, but maybe one day it will be more perfect. So just a couple of more comments on this from Ian, is 747 skipper. Probably answered this a little bit. Is there a standard procedure for use of CPDLC? He finds it confusing when the controller's talking to you 1 minute and then pinging you with information the next. He finds it breaks his awareness. He makes the comment like Linton done, it works very well oceanic, but you lose the bigger picture in a dynamic environment. And then Kira, as an ATCO, I love CPDLC. We have an interaction with fans and ATN, so we can do more with fans. There's a timeout issue that you mentioned in the oceanic airspace, so there's a sweet spot for transfer. If instructions aren't time critical, I'll use it when I possibly can, but anything time critical, it's always voice. One thing we don't have is free text, which I know pilots have. We have a line of, we have some line defined messages, but we can't free type. When it does go unserviceable, the workload does increase. And some of our newer controllers who have about it do no set. Kira works at Shannon en route. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Going back to a previous point, there is this situational awareness issue with CPDLC. I can't speak on behalf of the pilots, but if I'm the planner and not the tactical controller, so I'm making all the phone calls and coordinating aircraft to the next sector, or working on releases or giving clearances, departure clearances, then if my tactical controller is sending a number of messages, I lose that awareness of what's going on, the bigger picture, without having a scan of the radar and seeing what's been done. I'm sure it is the same as was mentioned for yourselves, that when you're flying, if you can't hear what's going on the sector, you can't tell, for example, how busy it is. There is that argument that having this mixed mode of voice and electronic messages can cause issues, as has been touched on.
Excellent. Any other comments on that? Okay, I'm just looking. I think the one thing, just to finish on that CPDLC, is when you I was always climbing out of London and you think, right, I'm above flight level 100 or something, it's gone a bit quieter, I'll log on to London, and then it tells you you're logging on to London, then it tells you again that it's London. Each time it's always accompanied by the oral chimes, which sound exactly the same as the cabin crew trying to get in through the flight deck door. So you get overwhelmed by chimes, and your head swiveling in all directions trying to work out where it's coming from. So if there's nothing else on CPDLC, then we can move on. We've got a question here. RNAV SIDS and stars from Daniel. He's a Doncaster radar ATCO. Question for pilots. Last year we introduced RNAV procedures, inbound and outbound. For the new SIDS, we were told not to remove the speed restrictions on the charts so that the plane will follow the procedure and not overshoot any. What are your thoughts here? Would it be more efficient to have a continuous climb with no speed restriction, always subject to traffic? Yeah, any thoughts on those, Linton?
Yeah, I apologise. My neighbour is gardener's turn, so if you can hear a leaf blower in the background, then I'm sorry about that.
That's the hazard of.
I think you might cease and desist now. Yeah, I think the advantages of a constant climb and a constant descent are being proven in a project that I was involved in a little while ago. Certainly, if we can, if ATC could facilitate that, I think we as pilots want to make that happen. Speed control, especially if you're flying a type that's quite heavy and at the edge of its performance, sometimes to meet speed control on the departure can be a little bit difficult. You can either have the altitude or you can have the speed. Is the two of those things don't always come together. But I think for planning purposes, having an understanding what speed is going to be required allows for that mental model and that kind of preparation for the descent to begin a lot earlier. So therefore, the machine can be programmed accurately. You're not heads down, and then when you're in that environment, I guess, what is the importance of the speed control? There is a safety element to it, and there's also, I guess, for the air traffic guys, on this discussion as well. It's all about scheduling that traffic into a pattern that you've got kind of control over, or you're feeling how the flow is going. And so if you need to speed people up to give them the priority or to slow them down a little bit earlier on, that's really important as well. So I guess having a plan that's communicated and everybody understands what the requirement is and why it's there. Charts are a little bit lacking in that, aren't they? We see a restriction which may be an altitude or a speed, and we don't really understand why it's there, and perhaps even some of the controllers don't, because it's been historic and that thing's actually moved or changed since it was implemented. So again, this airspace modernization program might help us sort of understand that a little bit better. And the benefits of an RMP arrival and departure means that we can, affect less people on the ground and hopefully be more environmental and more efficient as an operator, which is really important to us.
One obvious disadvantage to these routes so that they concentrate the noise in one area, and certain people will be affected constantly by all of the arrivals. So I can envisage a situation where there are multiple RMP routes to kind of provide some respite. So there are pros and cons to it. I believe it all comes from the push for RNAV routing. So I believe RNAV 5 has to come in and the RMP routes by 2024. Please someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have to have all routes as RNAV 5 by either 2024 or 2030. So that's where aircraft have to be able to fly within 5 nautical miles of their routing for at least 95% of the time, which doesn't seem to be a big ask. We actually have RNAV 1 routes en route airspace in the UK. So we're above that minima where aircraft have to fly within 1 nautical mile of the route for at least 95%. And this allows us to actually have aircraft on their own navigation a lot closer together than we're used to. Usually if you had aircraft at 6 or 7 miles passing beside each other, you would have the aircraft on a radar heading, but they're following these RNAV routes now. So yeah, that's all I've got to say about that.
I would completely agree with you there, Tom, and certainly we found that as well over here. If you compare to the Heathrow approach section, where most aircraft are actually on headings all the time, and here where you're flying an RNAV star, whether the actual accuracy is incredible. One of the things we certainly did have outbound RNAV procedures and also inbound is the inability of the various producers of these charts. So we'll give them the information, send it out to the various producers such as Jeppesen, to name but one, and then all the errors come into the actual the charts themselves. So we had various incidents where flyby points were then were actually sort of misunderstood and were flyover points, and vice versa as well. And that's quite an interesting thing, perhaps, that we don't think of in the aviation, on our side of the operational side of the aviation community, but perhaps happens on a more regular basis and when people are producing charts themselves.
While you were talking, Tom, I was just looking at my notes from the meeting. I went to the ICAMS meeting, and it talks. The notes I got here said the SIDS and stars. Aerodromes need a SID or star that's RNAV 1 by 25th of January 2024. So, and then it's going to be exclusive use of PBN by the 6th of June 2030. Are the dates, but nearly every date when I go to these meetings ends up getting changed. Talking about, there's another question here, an age-old question from Aaron. How far out from the hold is the arrival sequence into Heathrow decided? Varied anecdotal evidence from some. It's best to get to the hold as soon as possible. Others say the sequence is decided much earlier, so best to slow down for fuel and noise, etc.
So it certainly used to be the case that it was a lot more up to the controller which aircraft they were to make number 1, and then along came AMAN, which is an acronym which stands for Arrival Management or something like that, and then we have XMAN, and I think that's extended arrival management, but again, please someone correct me if I'm wrong. And what that provides to the controller is a list of all the aircraft into a particular hold. It's used at Heathrow and Gatwick mostly, and we will have a list, and that will provide an expected arrival time at the hold, let's say Biggin, for example, and it will also provide an estimated an estimated time for leaving the hold. So for example, you may be due to arrive at Biggin at 10:22 and your plan to leave Biggin at 10:31, and so I would provide a speed restriction to slow the aircraft up to reach the hold. It also provides a list of who's ahead of that particular aircraft and who's behind that particular aircraft. And if I can, I will try and match that sequence going into the Biggin hold. That's easier said than done, because quite often, no offense to my colleagues to the south, but the aircraft can come in all sorts of different heights and positions, and there could be 3 aircraft underneath the Heathrow arrival that I have to get the aircraft through. So it may be that the sequence changes depending on how easy it is to achieve that sequence. So I believe the XMAN arrival actually extends out now to 250 miles from Heathrow. So certainly our colleagues at Brest and at Maastricht and at Reims, they actually now provide speeds for aircraft to slow inbounds to Heathrow and Gatwick so that they can reduce some of that delay. So it really is, it's simply follow what the controller is saying. There's no push to kind of, if you get there first, you'll be bumped up the order. It does happen, but we try not to.
On an approach side of things, if I may add to that, Tom once again has explained the actual management system very, very completely. do see, especially at Heathrow, if we, and at Gatwick as well at the same time happened, if we do see an improvement to the sequence at the very last minute, or if we're using the team process, so the tactical arrival enhancement mode, I think it is more or less, when we're landing aircraft on the departure runway to Heathrow, then we may swap or change and pick an appropriate aircraft type to increase the efficiency of the landing rate. Also, it slightly changes during the early morning rush into Heathrow, where you're picking aircraft depending on the landing runway itself, depending on where they're parking as well. So actually, it'll be the supervisor who sits there at Heathrow and together with AMAN, or actually adjusting this arrivals manager's sequence to make a more sensible landing order, depending on where the aircraft is going to park subsequently when on the ground, and to obviously to reduce the load into one particular stack or another.
You're still on mute, Mike.
At least once. Yeah, I was just reading this from the Shannon controller. We get the X-man delay interval in Shannon to implement not the specific time over, but time to reduce, so reduce speed. We don't have the full info though, but traffic presentation does also impact.
May I just add one more point, Mike, if I may? I've been involved in the project of Swiss AMAN, and actually we're starting to get information now about arrival sequencing from aircraft on the ground at their departure airfield. So we're actually starting to integrate where the aircraft is, if it's on a pushback and taxiing out to the holding point, or when it actually becomes airborne. We're starting to get information now of that, even it may be 150, 250, even further out, miles away from the arrival aerodrome, but using that to start and create a sequence.
Okay. Same person's also got a question. We work with oceanic interface on one side, and especially at night, eastbound, we start the streaming of traffic off NAT for Heathrow on the other. If there's a choice for us westbound, if there's traffic for you and we're looking at options to call Shamwick, would you prefer a few thousand feet change, or a speed change with a possible time restriction? Likewise, but different heading east, we try to put miles in train for the Heathrow arrivals, but can we do it with less speed and more vertical changes? Do you have a preference? I'm sure my UK colleagues prefer miles in train, but he's asking from a pilot perspective. Lyndon.
Yeah, I think my preference would be on oceanic crossing to have the level that you want, because that's more efficient and usually take a speed penalty or a track in track miles. But I guess it's a very busy part of airspace, so you need to kind of make a compromise. But for me, it would always be trying to have the optimum level with the speed. But that's just a personal preference, and I don't know, Mike. That was with the 330, which was very efficient. You could climb, 390 was an early level that we could take, and I guess with the 78 now, it again can sort of look at 410 pretty much straight off the bat. So. I guess those days of being stuck down at the lower levels, which the 76, 74 probably suffered from a little bit because it was that much heavier. Maybe not as critical, but certainly with a longer range flight on the 330. Some days, if you were going to Cancun from the UK, then you want to make sure you've got as much fuel and got the level you want early on. And same coming back inbound, I think a lot of us would, although we don't want to slow down, we'd probably like to stay at the level as long as we could, that's most optimum, and take a little bit of a track mile or a speed penalty. But I think it's, again, it's different companies will have their own opinion, and it's pretty much up to the commander as well what they would preference, but that would be my choice.
Yeah,
from a controller's perspective, we certainly prefer miles in trail because that makes our life a lot easier. We can then vector the individual aircraft against other arrivals or to other airfields, as opposed to an arrival against another Heathrow arrival, for example, which creates a lot more workload.
Yeah, I think the thing I used to notice coming off the Atlantic was, you 8384, something like that. And you do that all the way to the UK boundary. Then the moment you talk to the UK guy, then you are straight back to 0.78. Can you do 7.8? Can you do 7.9 to do all fit in? And it didn't always seem that joined up, the sort of transition between them. But, running out of questions slightly, but I'll ask one of my own. So one of my last flights was Storm Kira. Managed to get myself on Big Jet TV, so it was on there. But they weren't using 2.7 right that day. The wind at 500 feet was from the south at nearly 80 knots. On the surface, it was gusting 40 knots straight across the runway. And in fact, if you were watching Big Jet TV that day, they had numerous go-arounds. And I was curious, we had a couple where they did rejected landings. So they actually touched down, and then the guys decided they didn't have maybe full control of the aircraft, and maybe it was drifting to the downwind side of the runway, and then they did a rejected landing and just got airborne again, which is obviously a maneuver we occasionally practice in the simulator, but very on the line. The missed approach for 2.7 left, of course, has a very low level off altitude at 2,000 foot, and I was just wondering what a tower controller is looking at, because he's probably looking at an aeroplane. If it's just touchdown, he's probably then switching his attention to the next one or stuff like that. I just wondered about your thought processes as you're watching aircraft landing in those conditions.
First thing is probably that I'm glad I'm sitting in a warm tower and watching you guys try it rather than me being sat down the back. Certainly from the Heathrow perspective, that 2,000 limit is quite quickly achieved afterwards anyway, and that's, I think, if I remember correctly, due to the Detling departures from the northern runway to build in some kind of control. In terms of dual runway airport, it's probably slightly easier to manage as you don't have something that's just airborne ahead of that rejected landing or a missed approach in that particular case. It's something that we have on a single runway airport, certainly at Gatwick and here in Geneva, is when you have the kind of piggyback go around scenario. So yes, we are looking at you whilst you touch down all the time. And from my personal experience, I'll be waiting to see the reverses deploy before I start trying to look at something else happening or the next aircraft in the sequence. The piggyback go around is probably the situation where you train for a lot in the simulator from our side of things, whether it's stopping at altitude and then taking vectors away as soon as we can. Here we're quite restricted in terms of terrain, obviously, in terms of turning aircraft below the minimum safe is just altitude is certainly not an approved procedure, and certainly something we don't do. So those are sort of things that we're looking into taking into consideration. And certainly if you're rejected landing and then entering the wake of a previous heavy departure, then that's certainly, we may have to take action in that particular case in turning you as quickly as possible using some kind of separation with the actual previous departure. It's a departure followed by a landing, all things being equal, there's no wake turbulence to take into account. We don't want you to enter that wake turbulence if at all possible. That's what I can say from the tower point of view, I suppose. Certainly we have ground movement radars now, so if on visibility or heavy rain or something, we couldn't actually see you at the threshold, then we have various tools in the tower that allow us to check whether you're still airborne or actually on the ground, and that sort of works on obviously altitude but also airspeed. And now with Mode S transponders, they can send us a link to give us an on-ground indication. And that's certainly something we use here. Sorry, Mike, I think you're on mute again.
Time. Linton, can you give us a pilot's eye view of flying an approach in those conditions for the controllers about the thinking about in terms of a possible either wind shear go around or whether it's just a destabilized approach that's going to have to cause you to do a missed approach?
Yeah, so when I first went to Tokyo, the guys talked about these spring storms, and I sort of didn't really quite appreciate how violent these things would be. A 40-odd knot wind almost across the runway. So for us, it's kind of like you say, we have our stability criteria that we're trying to monitor and make sure we understand what's going on around outside the airplane, as well as if you're the pilot not flying, monitoring all those parameters as well. And I guess you can leave it till really the last moment to go around, but once you've made that decision, it's very much you commit to that, and things get quite busy thereafter. It's so much easier when the instruction is to perhaps go straight ahead, but also that then creates some issues as well. Whereas if you just follow the standard missed approach, quite often you can engage the automatics and get back to sort of monitoring the situation, because it is a kind of a high workload. It gets the heart pumping, and like you say, you guys will want us to change frequency. We've got to make sure we have changed the aircraft in its configuration and start thinking about what the options are. Are we coming back for another go, or do we need to think about something else? So I hope that kind of answers the question, Mike.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And then there's always the differentiation between that and a wind shear go around about how quickly a pilot can actually tell a controller that he's going around. Because if it's a proper wind shear, a full energy wind shear go around procedure, then both pilots are in one flying either through the autopilot or flying manually, the other guy fully monitoring everything that he's doing. So his ability to get a radio call out quickly is pretty higher priorities to follow. And just to back that up, I think there's an article, Stu's on here I think today. He did a very good article. I think that, I don't know if it's been published now in the GATCO Transmit magazine, explaining from a pilot's point of view all the stuff that we're trying to do, and coupling that with ATCO's perspective of it. So I haven't seen the finished article, but there's more information there for everybody. I've got a question here from Graham. Sorry for a Heathrow-centric question, but in respect of RNAV approaches versus ILS approaches, we are always cleared RNAV approach, but never cleared ILS approach. Interested in the reasons, please.
So my information will date from about 3 years ago when I left Heathrow, but Luis, if he's still there, might correct me if I'm wrong. The ILS phraseology in the UK, especially what at Heathrow, is slightly different due to the minimum published on the arrivals chart. So I can't remember the exact altitude, it's probably around 2,500 feet, I think, which would bring you in conflict with the helicopter routes in and out of the city of London, and also potentially London City Airport inbound traffic as well. If you say cleared for the ILS approach, then the risk does exist of the flight crew to descend to the minimum altitude on that ILS approach, published on the as a final approach fix on that, an ILS approach, which would bring you into conflict with those aircraft. Why it's different from the RNAV? I think the RNAV approach started officially at 3,000 feet, so we could clear you straight away for that. Gatwick doesn't use the same phraseology, so if I remember correctly, we could clear you straight away for the ILS approach. I think that is the reason. Luis, please correct me if I'm wrong on that one.
He's not correcting you, so I'll assume that you're.
I would just say, if I may, very quickly, Jules, you're absolutely correct. And the only comment is that, yeah, the risk does exist, particularly in westerlies, and we have had instances of crews establishing on the local ice at 18, 19 miles. And you say the same with the glide path, they read back clear ILS, and they might be at 5,000 feet and immediately dial 2.5, which obviously we get into conflict with London City departures climbing to 3,000 feet, which is not for doesn't make for a good situation. So that's why we are quite strict, or we try to be quite strict with the descent with the glide path, because that means you can establish on the glide path and then continue. Because as you said, ILS approaches start at 2.5 into Heathrow. So if we say clear ILS, in theory, the pilot could just go straight down to 2.5, whatever he is. Thanks.
Hopefully that answers Graham's question.
May I ask a question?
You're allowed to ask a question, so go ahead.
I was going to ask, when you were asked to expedite climb, what would you take that as? What rate of climb would you do, Linton?
The best that I can achieve in a heavy 321. You might not get much more than what I'm currently doing, but yeah, you'd sort of be looking at, I guess, what, a minimum 1,000 feet a minute if you could achieve that. But in a heavy 321 with a tailwind, you're not going to get that. So, you know, we'd have to intervene or try and negotiate with you, perhaps another constraint, I guess. But in a 330, no problem. Yeah, you kind of, is it 1,000 feet or more? You could prove me, you could show my ignorance here.
I don't think there is a specified climb rate. I don't like the term unless I really, really have to use it. I prefer to specify a climb rate because I'm going to find out if you can achieve that climb rate or not, because hopefully you'll say, sorry, London, I can only do 1,000 feet per minute. But I know some of my colleagues use it regularly for different scenarios. And I think it's a bit of a woolly term to use, woolly instruction, because, as I say, you don't know what is achievable.
No, I think, you know, a regional European short-haul aeroplane with less weight is probably going to be able to achieve a much, much better climb rate than what a heavier airplane going a longer distance will be able to if they're at max takeoff weight or, you know, at the, you know, at the corner of their performance. So, like you say, assuming that we may already be giving you our maximum climb rate.
Okay.
I think there's often a slight sort of misunderstanding between us of max rate versus max angle, because sometimes when you're asking us for our best rate of climb, actually you want us to be higher at a given point, whereas max rate, it gives us our maximum rate of climb, but it will normally be at a higher forward speed. So it's different to max angle, where you're climbing at a lower speed, but you're going to achieve a greater height at a geographic point. There's also a question. Go ahead.
That was one of the questions that came up. I think for us as pilots, it's much easier to visualize a waypoint with a height restriction, and we can interrogate the information in front of us to give us a better idea whether we can meet that or not, and then negotiate with you and say, perhaps we can't meet that, you know, flight level 260 by that point, but actually we could give you, you know, 240. Would that be good enough? So, like you say, the max rate, max climb, max angle sort of, I think if you tell us what your restrictions are, we might be able to tell you whether we can meet that or not. Is probably the better way to have that transaction.
And just slightly linking to that, a question here from Jeremy in the UK. We're often asked to climb or descend to reach a level by a named waypoint, whereas in Germany and Switzerland, we are more likely to be given a fixed climb or descent rate in feet per minute. I find the former easier to fly and gives better situational awareness. Why the different methods?
That's mostly to do with what we call standing agreements in the UK. We have such a jigsaw puzzle of different sectors abutting each other. If you're being told to be flight level 190 by TEL2, that's to get you underneath the London Middle Sector's airspace, to keep you above the London T Terminal Control Southwest sector, to get you underneath the arrivals for Birmingham and East Midlands. So by using standing agreements, I can ensure that the aircraft are going into the correct sector at the correct level. Someone climbing a departure in Capital's airspace, which is the terminal control sector running over London from, I believe it's flight level 175 and above, they can tell an aircraft to be climbing to be flight level 210 at a distance before Midhurst, and that will ensure that the aircraft climbing will be above the aircraft descending into TEL2. So it all works as a big jigsaw puzzle. Where airspace is less constrained, or there aren't so many sectors abutting each other, you've got the flexibility to have aircraft entering the next sector's airspace, perhaps in the descent to a flight level or an altitude. But as I say, with the big jigsaw puzzle we've got in the UK, we use standing agreements regularly to reduce workload. And they work very nicely, but they're not very environmentally friendly. Ideally, if you're inbound to Stansted or Heathrow, you might only want to be at flight level 190 overhead Vatten, and not 30 miles further back at TEL2 or Mayfield.
Thanks, Tom. If I may just add to that, and from my side of things, we certainly do have standing agreements here in Swiss airspace as well. What I may say is probably perhaps it's more of a human factors issue. It's much, I suppose, a lot of the instructors at our basic college are retired controllers who are probably more used to using descent and climb rates rather than the phraseology for standing agreements past this point at a certain level or above. And it's probably easier for a non-native English speaker to actually give you a rate of climb rather than a pass X point at flight level 230 or above. That's from my particular perspective. I don't know, Linton, if you had that in the Far East.
Yeah, there were definitely the standing agreements were a big thing in Japan, actually, and having to read the AIP and understand that when you were going to get thrown off from Tokyo across to Kyushu control and stuff like that, you know, there were definite gates and very transactional in the way that you were handed over, certainly domestically, and then I guess for those international arrivals into the Far East, you know, that it was well documented about the arrivals that were required. But I guess that's one way of you know, managing that language issue. A question came up there on via the chat, Mike, about standard phraseology, which I guess is appropriate just to mention here whilst I'm on. That yeah, Japan were very strict in their readbacks, I guess, because of that language barrier. As Julian has sort of mentioned, that, you know, that sort of that easy transaction that we have in native English is fine for us as native English speakers, but for those that are using it as a sort of functional language where they're using set terms that mean specific things, to go off track from that then does cause some, you know, can cause some issues really. So I guess having the rule sets, understanding what you know, what you're trying to achieve really does help things, you know, rather than kind of trying to have that negotiation in non-standard phraseology. So yes, I think we should be more strict in the way we use our standard phraseology, and I guess having fun in the US quite a bit, you know, there are different standards applied around the world, and it's kind of good to see that in the UK. I think that there's a good sort of certainly from the training, my old training department, you know, there was good kind of emphasis on, you know, using the right phraseology at the right time to make sure that you very well understood it at what clearance you're accepting and what you're going to carry out.
Thank you very much. Just similar to that, I've got one here from John. A CAA report from 2017 concluded not all controllers outside the UK demonstrated the minimum ICAO language proficiency required to work in international aviation. Do any of the pilots have this experience? Secondly, the report also found issues with native English speakers lapsing into plain English, both pilots and controllers, and not using ICAO phraseology, particularly in stressful situations. Are there any actions pilots and controllers can take to avoid this relapse, if indeed they should? Linton, from what you said earlier, they seem pretty strict in Japan. If so, should it be like that everywhere?
Like I said, I think you know, English is a, you know, a common language, but certainly where we do diverge and start to use colloquialism, and I think you see that more in the US than perhaps you do in sort of the UK or Europe, but certainly in the Far East, where, you know, it is, you know, English is very different to the native spoken language. Making sure that you stick with that standard phraseology really is important to make sure that you're understood and that you understand what's being instructed to you and what clearance you're accepting. So for sure, I think we should aim to be more proficient in the standard phraseology for sure.
I would just add to that when it comes to executive instructions, I fully agree. We should be sticking to the ICAO phraseology, not only to ensure that there's no ambiguity, but also, as we talked about earlier, for the situation awareness for other pilots listening on the frequency. I know there are issues in parts of the world where multiple languages are used on the same frequency, and that reduces situational awareness. One thing I would though add is that in the unusual situations, say for example emergencies, or when something can't be achieved, it's all about the communication for me, and it's about getting the message across. I often find that certainly from a personal point of view, I would much prefer to be told if an aircraft can't make a level early, or struggling to achieve something, so that I can do something about it. And it doesn't always happen. Often an aircraft won't make the level because they've been restricted by the speed. If you can't make the level, that speed restriction, please tell us. And sometimes that requires the non-standard phraseology.
Thank you. Just looking at the next question from Tom. Often in real life, emergency situations are not always immediate events like engine failures, etc., but can be more complex and slowly developing. Particularly, it's not always clear immediately what or if any assistance we require. We are told that to get priority holding to always declare a pan or a mayday, but in terms of sharing our mental model to the controllers for a situation that may develop into a more severe one, e.g. a disruptive or ill passenger, is it useful to let the controllers know more informally that an emergency call may be forthcoming, or is it better just to wait until we know for sure the emergency we're in and do the more traditional pan mayday call?
Absolutely, and that follows on from my last point, really. The more information I have, the better. Even if something doesn't develop into an emergency situation, at least if I know there's an issue, I can get on the phone early, check that an airfield can accept a diversion, for example, or arrange for priority with the next sector. If that emergency situation doesn't develop or changes, then it's a lot easier to go back to a normal kind of situation. So yeah, certainly with any kind of situation, the more information I have, the better. We do have the option to use discrete frequencies, so that can always be an option, and it also allows me to get someone back from the canteen to come and help me. If there's a situation developing, I can make the sector smaller, or even speak to you on a separate frequency, while my colleague then deals with the rest of the traffic, and then we can provide a really good service, as it were, a really centric service to your situation. I don't know if Jules wants to add anything to that when it comes to emergencies.
No, I completely agree, Tom. And I think I would rather the flight crew overcook the situation and declare something perhaps a scale above than what it actually is, rather than keep the information to themselves and come out at a later date. And obviously on the ground, there's things to organise as well should you need assistance. So if God forbid you declared a mayday, then and then subsequently downgraded it, that's fine too. So at least I know what to plan for and be able to get the assistance out at the right level. Here we go.
Can I add that although you are right, whoever asked the question, that unless a pan or a mayday is declared, we're under no obligation to provide a priority service. We will do our best to assist however we can up to that point. So it may be that you would, if we can, provide a more direct routing, if we can, even if you haven't declared a pan or a mayday. So it's best to let us know early so that we can do that.
Any thoughts, Linton, on?
I guess it's that communication kind of loop in it. The more people you can advise of your situation, the more people can give you some assistance. So I guess the nature of the question was, do we escalate things early and then de-escalate it? It might be another way to phrase it, really. And the feedback from Julian and Tom seems to be that I think they'd rather it be a higher escalation, and then if you need to downgrade it, then to do that. Certainly, I think there is a bit of a debate about, do you go to PAN and then go to the Mayday? Is PAN widely understood overseas? And I know from safety reports and some experience that in different parts of the world, PAN is not perhaps as widely recognized or kind of understood as what a Mayday is. And then certainly from a pilot perspective, going straight to a Mayday means lots of paperwork for us and kind of questions. So there wouldn't say there's a reluctance to use that, but I guess that is kind of if you go to a Mayday straight away, then you've used all of the tools in your toolbox, so to speak. So this is the tricky part then, isn't it? Do you have a transactional conversation that is kind of in conversational English about, we've got a problem, can you help us out? Or really should it be prefaced with, a pan call and, we need this assistance, and away you go. So it's a tricky one. And depending on the nature of the situation and what the priorities are, may sort of mean that you need to escalate that quite quickly, in the sense of if you've got limited fuel, or there is a long in-trail to your destination, or if the passenger, if it's someone that with medical needs, then for sure you're going to escalate that. Would be my kind of perspective on that, Mike.
Yeah, and certainly from my sort of years of sim training, I think pilots generally, as excuse me, as a general observation, are reluctant to declare a Mayday. I think they'd rather sort of underplay it. And we often used to have chats afterwards about, so you're landing, you've got a complete hydraulic failure in one system, or possibly affecting a second system. And we know that the landing should be without incident, because we've done all the drills and it should all work. But then you've got to always take into account, what if something else goes wrong? Because what if the tires burst and then you slide off the runway and you haven't announced any sort of real problem to the air traffic controller? That's a bit late for them to try and help you. So we often have that conversation in the simulators. Just to add on to that, there's another question about disruptive passengers. Do pilots have different levels of threat, and how do you categorize a disruptive passenger? We did in BA certainly levels 1 to 4, and I remember it coming in at the time, and 1 was the usual abusive gobby passenger that was just sounding off in the passenger. 4 was sort of flight deck ingress has been compromised on it. And I remember we were coming back to Heathrow, and we reported, we thought ACAR's message back to the company saying we had a level 1 passenger on board. And when we landed, sure enough, we got met, but we got met by customer services because they thought we meant a VIP. So they got a slightly different handling to the one we expected. There was another question here, just down here.
Just while Mike's looking, just to say that we had similar things the same. I think it's pretty standardized, actually, that the system 1 through to 4, and you may even have a discrete way of being able to inform your company via an ACARS message that you've had some sort of issue going on. It just depends on the operator as to how they sort that out, for sure.
I'm sure I saw another question in here somewhere, but I can't find it just at the moment.
There was one question earlier, Mike, that I noticed about frequencies and, dialing up the next frequency or being ready for the next frequency. And I think the response was a lot of controllers don't issue the next frequency quite often because that could be a distraction, or that pilots will preset that before the takeoff roll. My other one comment would be to the different types of charting, having been a Lido user in the past and then recently used Jeppesen. The way that they promote that information on the chart is, shall I say, a little bit frustrating. When you're used to finding a frequency in one point and then you change to something else, which is different, trying to find that next frequency is always a little bit difficult. In the US, they quite often will give you the frequency as you're lining up and a heading instruction, as while you're trying to monitor what's going on and line up the aeroplane as well. So I think that can be a little bit tricky, and quite often they won't even advise the frequency change. They'll just tell you to switch across to the departure or expect you to do that. And it's quite a busy time. We discussed earlier on about, wind shear events and things like that. So especially out of Orlando, when you do a departure and you're leveling off at 2,000 feet in a heavy jet that's about to cross the Atlantic, and you're worrying somebody's going heads down to try and change a frequency in the box, and you're looking out for lots of light traffic, that can be an issue. So my comments on that would be, wouldn't it be great if chart service providers could be a little bit more interactive or have some augmented reality that, at the moment, I think most of although we have electronic flight bags, they are essentially PDFs that are kind of a paper document. And wouldn't it be great if we had some sort of more connectivity or the ability for that frequency to kind of flash up in front of your face, so you wouldn't have to go diving around on the chart to try and find where it was, and monitor what is my level off, what's the next restriction going to be, and things like that. So I think in the future it'd be great if we can get that sort of more dynamism in the charting. But just the comment or the question that was asked about should controllers be giving you the next frequency as you line up, there are some threats with that as well. I guess that you could be distracted by trying to dial that up whilst you're lining up on the runway, or shouldn't be lining up because there's still an aircraft on the approach and things. So I'm not quite sure. Tom, do you have a view on that one?
It's a long way below where I operate at 2,000 feet, but yes, I mean we use a number of frequencies. When I'm working tonight, I'll have 7 different frequencies dialed up, and they'll be cross-coupled, but they are the standard frequencies. So there certainly is scope to have that information available via the chart producers, so that roughly the frequency. It was actually something I was thinking about a moment or two ago about loss of communications. We have issues where aircraft go out of range of a transmitter site, and then when the previous controller tries to transfer them to the next sector, the crew can't hear the transmission, and they come into UK airspace not speaking to anybody. They might not be on 1215, so we can't call them on there. So having that information available on a chart would be beneficial to the crews and also to ourselves, because when an aircraft doesn't call us, all sorts of different things happen, shall we say.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. If Stu Clark's out there, I can't find your question, Stu. Could you just come on line and just ask that question, because I can't find it at the moment?
Yeah, hi, Mike. Thanks very much. Yeah, it was just a query, actually. You touched on it there in terms of com loss. It's something that's concerned us over recent years, and the possibility that pilots might be subject to legal sanction, in fact, as a result of com loss. And there are lots of issues. It's not always just sort of inattentiveness or finger trouble, but monitoring multiple frequencies, perhaps in aircraft types that have only got a couple of transmitters and there are company frequencies going on, all this sort of thing. So the thought was, just a general thought, that rather than wait for the typhoons to turn up on the day, which is always embarrassing, how about alternative methods to gain communication with pilots who've got a com loss situation, such as ACARS, perhaps?
That's a very good point. I've thought about that myself. When you have 2 aircraft on frequency from the same operator, that's an avenue you can explore, to speak to the other crew and ask if they can get in contact via ACARS. We've also got the CPDLC functionality, so you can ask the previous sector to try and transfer them by CPDLC, so they'll get that message that way. The big problem seems to be it's not always. It's a lot of the time it can be the controller that's caused this issue. If a sector is skipped, then there's a high chance that the crew will be out of range of the transmitter site and they won't receive the message. We ask other aircraft to broadcast to see if they can receive the message via another crew on the frequency. So there's lots of different solutions to the problem. But it has been a major issue over the last few years, and there probably are some very good creative solutions to this problem that haven't been identified. And ACARS is probably a very good one. It's not always used by controllers.
It's something that we use, especially on the ground, a lot. We have all the telephone numbers of all the operating and handling agents. We can get hold of those guys directly that can then send a message through a company frequency if the flight crew are listening out on that as well. ACARS, and also send a different ACARS message. So Swiss International Airlines, we've used that very often in the past. And I know from the days in the tower at Heathrow that we used to do that occasionally with BA, but that very occasionally.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the question. Louise, is that our time up? I was just looking at the clock. Is that the end of our 90 minutes?
It is, but if we can, there are a few more questions, so we can probably carry on for another 10-15 minutes just to finish off some of those questions there, if you're happy.
Okay, yeah, absolutely fine. Let me just look down the list. Who's Hal Newbury, why is there a contrast in understanding between ATC and pilot groups? Should there be integrated training between the two professions? Or is there a reliance on technology that creates high workloads such as radio communication? What do you think the future could become to create a better synergy?
From my side, it's certainly something I appreciated in the days when I was a controller with NATS was the different the visits, obviously, from the flight tech community to the controllers, but also the opportunity to be able to share emergency training together with scenario training for aircrew, and it's something that I've been trying to promote over here too. I know of all countries, Indonesia, for example, they have a joint ATCO and pilot training college, and certainly a lot of the initial training is done together as groups. That would be something very interesting. I'm not sure if that would be possible in a kind of a privatized scenario that we have in the Western world, but certainly it has its advantage.
Thoughts, Tom?
Yeah, as Jules has said, I was very lucky when I started my training. I was given some free flying hours. We had a session with BA at Cranebank, and we also had some familiar flights with various different airlines. And that was all really, really useful experience to understand the workload that you guys face at different parts of the flight, to get a feel for what's going on in the cockpit, how busy the frequencies can be, and all sorts of different things. And it's always really useful when we have visitors down at Swanwick coming to, as Jules says, to our stack sessions or to even sit on the frequency. Unfortunately, it seems that these things are becoming less and less. These opportunities are less and less available, and certainly there's a push to get controllers valid on the sectors as quickly as possible. So certain aspects of their training are reduced to what they were. But any kind of interaction like this, I think, is really, really useful to kind of get a dialogue going that obviously we can't have on the frequencies.
Linton, thoughts?
Yeah, likewise. I think the closed flight deck door has really put a barrier to so much interaction that we've had in the past, and it's a shame that flight deck visits aren't kind of, not only from ATC but also from the from the public to kind of see what does go on and how busy things are. But yeah, definitely, if we can't enable those flight deck visits and for controllers to come and spend a day with pilots, maybe there's the option to, within the training program, to have some controllers come and sit in on more of the recurrent training, if it's possible to jump in the simulator, or even, like you say, these sort of forums, I think really do kind of add value, where people can just kind of ask those questions where we're normally in a transactional way, minimal time, and to try and get that message across. This is a great way of sharing sort of those models, and I think I've learned a lot today through the conversation, which I hope everybody else has as well.
Yeah, I think definitely as more technology has come into both our jobs, it's almost in some ways dividing us as our jobs get more specialized, and then we don't get that opportunity that we used to take the Gatwick controllers across the Atlantic to somewhere, have beers for a couple of nights and fly back again, and okay, it was good fun. They could do their shopping and everything, but there's also an awful lot that's picked up and learnt during the course of it. There was a comment here from Miles Gents, a very interesting session. I'm a big believer that more time pilots and controllers spend together, the better. Professional liaison is a great way to get a greater understanding of both professions, which does lead to better operations. UK ATC is superb. I think he means Swiss ATC as well there, Jules. So keep up the good work. And there's a lot of comments about, yeah, more cooperation. You can probably, Tom, do you get involved in the stack, or what's the name of the training? It's, is it stack, right?
It is stack. I have in the past presented on our stack sessions, but now I just have to attend them instead. And they're very useful sessions. It's a chance to ask questions. It's, I mean, obviously I'm talking from a NATS point of view now. We have controllers come to at Swanwick, and we have pilots come along to these sessions and ask questions and answer questions, and that's really, really useful. So I'm sure NATS would be very grateful for anyone who can volunteer for such sessions, because it is really good input for ourselves. As I said before, we don't get that link so much anymore, and as you quite rightly say, Mike, as we get more and more technology into the operation, you guys can't see what we're seeing and what we're doing, and we can't see what you're doing or what you're seeing. The opportunities are available. I'm sure post-COVID there will be more opportunities. Just have to ask, really.
Brilliant. And there's a comment on there from Will that will appeal to all pilots out there that say NATS pay mileage and provide lunch. So all the pilots in the air with that. So sadly a quiet time for a lot of pilots, but yeah, maybe there's an opportunity to at least go and do that. That's probably a suitable point, I think, is it, to finish on, Luis? Is there anything else that we wanted to cover before I?
Let me just say that obviously a few more questions, and we've collected all the questions, so we'll try and get back to everyone who's asked a question with an answer. But yeah, I would agree with that if you're happy to close the session.
Okay. Yes, you're right. I mean, there's more coming in, and it just shows the you know, we need to do these sort of things a little bit more often, and yeah, we can get answers to that and maybe put the answers on our respective forums at the correct place for it, I think. Okay, so well, thanks for all your excellent questions today. There's never going to be enough time really to with this format to get. We'll put some answers on the forums, and if not, we'll save them for the next symposium in 2021, which hopefully will be face to face as opposed to sort of meeting like this. Although I do think this method, it's easy for all of us just to tune in and just hear our colleagues speak. It's great. So can I thank Jules, Tom, Linton, thanks very much indeed for all your answers. Thanks for everyone who's come and attended today. Really appreciate those efforts. There are 3 more webinars to come. Next Monday, also starting at 10 o'clock, Monday the 16th. It's on the subject of mindfulness and well-being for pilots and ATCOs, and helping not just yourself, but maybe some of your colleagues. I don't know the speaker. Luis, maybe would you like to say a little bit more on who's coming next Monday?
Yeah, we have a speaker, David Garcia Hermosilla, who's an air traffic controller in Spain with NAIRE, and also is human factors practitioner qualified from Eurocontrol with quite a depth and wealth of experience in the topic of mindfulness. So hopefully it'll be interesting for everyone and relevant in the current times.
Thanks very much indeed, Luis. So with that, I'll wrap it all up. I'll ask you to click off and leave. We'll probably just stay on just for a couple of minutes and just have a little wash up maybe at the end. And I wish you a very good day and hopefully see you all soon.